Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and we're continuing our series dismantling the canonical interpretation of Josephus's Against Appian, where he proposes, at least many people believe, a 22 book canon. In that canonical interpretation, we've been dismantling piece by piece over all the various episodes, and we're actually at a very important juncture in our investigation, in that we're looking at the distinction that Josephus is making between the 22 books and the histories that were written after Artaxerxes. In the previous episode, we looked at that distinction, which he says is the failure of the exact succession of prophets. And we looked at a dynastic-like model where it was argued that, well, if the exact succession of prophets failed, it fails a lot like the dynasty of a king. Once the dynasty is broken and that dynastic line stops, that's the end of the story. And so it's argued that once this prophetic person-to-person succession fails, then anything written afterwards could not be prophetic. It could not be inspired scripture. And we showed how multiple points of problems with this dynastic-like model is. Doesn't comport with scripture, doesn't comport with how Josephus recounts scripture, doesn't comport with his argumentation. And even more importantly, there's a problem because Josephus very explicitly identifies John Hyrcanus, who lived after Artaxerxes, as a prophet, which shouldn't be possible if the dynastic line model is true. Well, you know what? There's more on the table than just the dynastic line model. There's another model that we're going to examine today, and that's the philosophical school model. And we're going to see whether or not this philosophical school model is able to fill in the gaps, so to speak. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. Well, there are lots of problems with the dynastic model that we talked about. The idea that once the exact succession of prophets failed, that there couldn't be any more prophets, there couldn't be any more prophetic writings, there couldn't be any scripture written. And that's important for the canonical interpretation. And we've shown that that's just simply not possible if you take seriously what Josephus says in his works, right? And I think one of the biggest problems is the presence of John Hyrcanus, who is one of two people Josephus identifies as a prophet after Artaxerxes. John Hyrcanus, I think we're going to focus on him because everyone admits that Josephus saw him as a prophet. He even says he conversed with the deity. He gave predictive prophecy. He calls him a prophet. Okay, so there's no doubt that at least one prophet existed after Artaxerxes. So the dynastic line idea just doesn't work. So perhaps there is another way to reconceive this, and that is the philosophical school model. So the philosophical school model actually has a lot of good things going for it. So let's take a look at it, but we'll look at it critically. The idea that Josephus has an exact succession of prophets, it could be based on a Greco-Roman tradition of institutional or intellectual succession as found in philosophical schools. In this model, the succession of prophets is like the succession of philosopher teachers who pass on a philosophical tradition from generation to generation. And it's this model, gaps can occur. So it's not quite as strict as the dynastic model. There could be some small gaps, but the institution continues, the philosophical school continues. But the succession of philosophy teachers continues as long as the original philosophy lives on. And this is where this model attempts to explain things like John Hyrcanus being a prophet. As Widow explains, he says, quote, if there is not exact succession, the chain of transmission is interrupted, then those who come after that moment have no access to the thinking of the original master, and so do not deserve equal credit, regardless of whether Josephus attributes the gift of prophecy to a historic figure after Artaxerxes. So the thinking is this: it's like a philosophical school. So there doesn't have to be an exact succession of philosophy teachers, just as long as that tradition continues. The original master's teachings continue, but there does come a time where that ceases, and therefore the teachings of the master is lost. And so even if you try to restart and revive that particular philosophy, whatever it is, it won't be deserving of equal credit as the earlier philosophical school. And like I said, there's lots of advantages to this model. For example, it explains why Josephus really doesn't explain explicitly in Against Appian what he means by the succession of prophets. If he's building it on this Greco-Roman model, it would have been obvious to his readers what the succession was all about. And so hence it explains the silence in Josephus. It also loosens up the strict person-to-person succession. And so it allows for occasional post-Artaxerxes prophet to appear without actually damaging the integrity of the earlier school. And moreover, Josephus does talk about philosophical inquiry into historical records. Earlier in Against Appian, we've noted that in our earlier episode as well. So it does have a lot going for it. It does have some explanatory power. But let's look critically at it, because I think it also fails and fails very badly to explain all the data. For example, the philosophical institutional succession model is just as untenable as the dynastic model in that it suffers from the same problems. For example, although it can tolerate gaps better than the dynastic-like model, it still fails to account for the gaps in the prophetic activity during the 22-book period, where the use of the word succession would be, as Mullins says, an abuse of language. So these gaps, according to this model, would negate the, quote, thinking of the original master, unquote, just as much as gaps would be after the 22 books. So it fails in that sense. More importantly, the philosophical school model does not fit Josephus's description of prophets in Against Appian prior to him talking about the 22 books. Prophets are not those who preserve and hand on tradition. This is a very important point for Josephus. They're not the ones who are passing on tradition. Actually, it's quite the opposite. In Against Appian, prophets are historians who learn through revelation what occurred in the most distant past and record plainly the events that take place in their own time, just as they occurred. And you can see this in Against Appian 137. So the value of these contemporary historians is not that they passed on the philosophy of the original master, but rather that they accurately recorded what occurred in their day. Again, the focus is on history. Okay, it's not passing on tradition like the Greco-Roman model. So what exactly is the exact succession of prophets? Well, I think a more satisfying explanation of the exact succession of prophets and its failure is that the exact succession occurred when contemporary history writing prophets produced, as a whole, a continuous and sometimes overlapping historical narrative. When the historical writing prophets became more sporadic, the historical narrative that they produced likewise became discontinuous, leaving some periods without public records. Therefore, it is not prophets who are contingent upon the exact succession, but rather its superior historiography that is contingent upon the exact succession of prophets. Let me repeat that, because that's a very important distinction between the models we've talked about and our model. It's not prophets who are contingent upon the exact succession, but rather it's superior historiography that's contingent upon the exact succession of prophets. And I believe Josephus actually tells us what is the exact succession if you just connect the dots in what he says from sections 37 to 41. For example, he makes these 3 points, and if you combine the 3 points, you come out with the same conclusion. Point number 1, only prophets can write history. Point number 2, each prophet wrote what took place in his own time. And this, by the way, is true for Moses. He wrote about what happened in his own day, and he was also given revelation to fill in the gap between creation and his own time. So they're all contemporary historians, so to speak. And then number three, the pre-Artaxerxes prophets enjoyed an exact succession. You combine all three. Only prophets write history. Each prophet wrote what took place in his own time. There was an exact succession prior to Artaxerxes. What you come up with is the exact succession of prophetic authors of contemporary histories results in an exact succession of contemporary histories that are regulated, continuous, and comprehensive. In other words, they're superior historiography, which is exactly what he's trying to show, that the Judeans not only match those cultures, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, but they exceed them as even better historiographers. Okay, so they're even more trustworthy than the most trustworthy that the Greeks believe. Conversely, the failure of an exact succession of prophetic contemporary historians results in a body of discontinuous and less comprehensive historiography. It makes a lot of sense, and it's very straightforward. And I think it's right there in against Appin when you carefully look through his argumentation and specifically how he addresses these 3 points. In fact, I think even if you look even more closely at Josephus and you look at how he describes the two periods, I think he's actually making that distinction in his wording. For example, he describes the period prior to Artaxerxes as a record of all time, but he describes the latter period after Artaxerxes as being every event has been recorded. And I think Winstons Translation, I think, is helpful here. I think he hits the nail on the head when he translates that as, our history hath been written since Artaxerxes very particularly. It's possible, therefore, to see in Josephus' own wording that all ages were recorded before Artaxerxes, but only particular events were recorded after Artaxerxes. So you can see here, I think, if you look carefully at how he describes these things, if you look carefully at the distinctions he's making and lay out how he understands historiography like we've done in the series, I think you come to that conclusion. What's interesting is a scholar named Rebecca Gray wrote a fantastic book called The Prophetic Figures in Second Temple Judaism, I believe. And Rebecca Gray actually comes to the same conclusion, but via a different route. She's looking at sources that Josephus used in antiquities, and then she posits that Josephus must have arrived at the exact succession idea when the abundant sources up to Artaxerxes ends up with just a very few afterwards. So she thinks that Josephus, while doing antiquities, realized that there is a ton of sources prior to Artaxerxes, not so much afterwards. And so that's how he comes up with the exact succession model. So a different route than we take, but it still ends up with the same conclusion. And what's interesting is the best Josephine scholar out there, in my humble opinion, is Stephen Mason. And he confirms this in an odd way, actually looking at the sources of Josephus in antiquities. Mason writes, quote, as soon as he is finished with the biblical narrative at the time of Artaxerxes, which is in Antiquities of the Jews 11-296, immediately thereafter, Josephus briefly summarizes the high priestly succession century, and then jumps ahead to Alexander the Great, who appeared, quote, at about this time, unquote, a century later. The chronological gap papered over by this characteristic phrase. And then he continues, the chronological unevenness of the remainder of the antiquities alerts us to Josephus' personal knowledge that his continuously connected sources up to this point, the records are exhausted, unquote. So the exhaustion of Josephus's continuously connected sources resulting in a, quote, chronological unevenness of the remainder of the antiquities, unquote, is nothing other than the failure of the exact succession of prophets. It's as simple as that. All right, so The strength of our conclusion, therefore, is that it's been confirmed by two different routes of inquiry, and they both coalesce to the same conclusion. It also coheres very well with Josephus's overall argumentation throughout against Appian, and it has very, very good explanatory power. It also fits very well with his argumentation. Remember, Josephus promises way back in Against Appian 1:4 that he is going to turn his detractors' convictions against them. And how does he do that? He looks at the cultures that the Greeks thought were the most trustworthy when it came to history. And he outlines why they're trustworthy and why Greek historiography, in contrast, is not. And then he shows that these Judean records actually supersede that of the most trustworthy cultures. And so once he comes up with this idea of the 22 books covering that period that was disputed by his detractors, he shows the 22 books actually are superior to the best historiography according to the Greeks. He has clinched his case. Now, we'll just finish right there. That is my own position. I think it's a pretty firm position. So I hope you like the series. If you do, please subscribe, like. If you like the stuff on the channel, do it. Just smash that subscribe button. Do a thumbs up, leave some comments. That helps our algorithm. Until next time, I'm Gary Michuta. I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.